to Michelle Zach, who will introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
I'm just here to introduce someone who practically everybody knows, Allhoff, who's the chairman of Altadena Heritage, and he doesn't like a long introduction. He just wanted to make it clear that he's a Zane Grey enthusiast. I think it's really clear to everyone, but that he's not a scholar, an academic scholar, but I know that he's done plenty of research. And Hans, we just can't wait to hear from you, so please take it.
All right, I will ask again, can everyone hear me? Yes? All right. If you ever can't, raise your hand and say, Hans, we can't hear you. So the first thing I want to do, the unsung heroes of this lecture series, can our friends from Bungalow Heaven Neighborhood Association please stand and raise their hands? They do an amazing amount of work with logistics. They have cooked for you out of a Zane Grey cookbook. So thank you again, BHNA. Thank all of you for being here. I am not going to make it through tonight without crying. I will just tell you that right now. I love Zane Grey. I love Zane Grey. Question, how many people have never read one word Zane Grey has written? How many people have some passing familiarity with Zane Grey? Okay, so almost half and half. Well, a friend of Zane Grey is a friend of mine, so let's get going. So last month, we talked about Octavia Butler. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Well, the definitive biography of Zane Grey opens with a note that he wrote to his mistress in 1932. I'd like to read it to you. Once I get my glasses on. Most people are as they are. You can't change them. I change always. But then I am not normal, not ordinary in any sense. So if Octavia Butler tells us that God is change, and if Zane Grey tells us that he changes always and is not normal, the question for tonight is, was Zane Grey God? On October 21st, 1939, the great Zane Grey appears at Vroneman's bookstore to meet his fans, to sign books. By all accounts, he's in a wonderful mood. He's happy to meet all of his readers. It's a lovely evening. And he was a very fit guy. Had to stay fit for all of his adventures all over the world. Kept a rowing machine on the terrace of the Zane Grey estate so that he could stay in shape for his adventures, stay in peak cardiovascular fitness. Nonetheless, 2 days after he appears at Vroneman's, he wakes up at the Zane Grey estate, he has a heart attack, and he dies. The great Zane Grey has perished on October 23rd, 1939. He is cremated, and many, many years later, his ashes are buried in Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania. It took me forever to memorize Lackawaxen. I'd like to say it together. 1, 2, 3, Lackawaxen as a room. Ready? 1, 2, 3, Lackawaxen. That is where Zane Grey is buried to this day. But after the Eaton Fire in summer of 2025, I was in Kalispell, Montana. My dad lives in Whitefish, Montana, and every time I visit him, I love to go to Kalispell to go to Blacktail Mountain Books. Why do I love Blacktail Mountain Books? I love the facade of the store, I love that mural, and I love their Western section. Now, I want to call your attention, if you can see my red dot, to this empty shelf. Can everybody see that? So that is where you would expect to find Zane Grey's books. If you're going alphabetical by author, Grey should be right there. As you can see, no books. I walk up to the front of the store. I wake up the owner, who's about 85 years old. I said, hey man, I don't see any Zane Grey books. Where are they? Are you out? Do you keep them somewhere else? He said, well, that shelf where they would be is really, really high for a lot of people, and they're so popular, we just keep them in boxes on the floor. And you can probably see these boxes down here. So sure enough, I walk back, and I look down, and there are boxes full of Zane Grey books. And this was, I promise you, this was before this talk was planned. But I stood there, looking down at these Zane Grey books, and I had a vision of Pasadena, and I thought to myself, if I ever have to explain Zane Grey's books to an audience in Altadena, I think I can do it with one photograph. Are you all ready for the one photograph that I think sums up Zane Grey's books?
Yeah.
Zane Grey's books are the Roma sandwiches of Western literature. What do I mean by that? Well, number one, there is an infinite supply of them. They are digestible, they're satisfying, but above all, they are really, really beloved. So who was this guy, and where did he come from? Zane Grey is born in 1872 in Zanesville, Ohio. His mother is a descendant of the Zane family that founded the town. His favorite place growing up is Dillon Falls on the Licking River in Zanesville, Ohio. This is about 2 miles from this house where he grew up. He goes to the University of Pennsylvania. Any Penn grads in the room? Not one. Oh man. He goes to Penn to do 2 things: play baseball and follow in the footsteps of his dad and study dentistry. After he graduates in 1896, he has a very, very brief go at playing professional baseball. It does not work out for him, and he opens a dental practice on the Upper West Side in New York City at 100 West 74th Street. In that building, that is where Zane Grey was a dentist after he graduated from Penn. But here's the thing, he's kind of a shitty dentist. And he's pretty uninspired too. He doesn't want to be a dentist, he's not that good at it. And he's honest about this in an essay he wrote in the American magazine in July, I don't remember the year, but the essay is called My Own Story. I'd like to read to you a passage from it. When I was graduated from college, I went to New York. But here, as in college, I dreamed. My mind wandered to the hills and vales, to adventure. During my brief vacations, I got as far away from the city as possible. So if it's 1900 and you're in New York City and you want to get out of the city, where do you go? He goes to Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania. Lackawaxen is on the Pennsylvania-New York border. The Delaware River rips right through it. He would actually move here in 1905 to this very, very parcel right here. And that tombstone I showed you at the outset is in a church cemetery right here. And a lot happens in his life in Lackawaxen, but I want to highlight 2 things. The first piece of writing that Zane Grey ever publishes is a 2-page article in Recreation magazine in 1902. It is called A Day on the Delaware. It's a very short 2-page essay about an afternoon fishing with his brother. More importantly, it is in Lackawaxen that Zane Grey meets Dolly Grey. He is canoeing on the river, she's having a picnic on the shore, he paddles over and introduces himself, their romance is born. Parenthetical. Dolly Grey deserves an Altadena revealed of her own. Her life is just as big as his. Please don't think that I'm glossing over Dolly Grey. She was his editor, his grammar teacher, his English teacher, his business manager. She was also, get ready for this, Dolly Grey was the first president of the Altadena Library Board of Directors. She was much, much, much more involved in the fabric of civic and social life in Altadena than he was. But get ready for this. After Zane Grey meets Dolly Grey, he sends her an invoice on his dental letterhead for the toll that she is taking on his heart. That invoice is published in a really remarkable book, Dolly and Zane Grey, Letters from a Marriage. If you really, really want an insight into Zane Grey's mind, this is the book to go to. But I'd like to read you this invoice that Zane Grey sent to Dolly Grey. Zane Grey, DDS, 100 West 74th Street, New York City, January 29th, 1902. Miss Lena Roth, services. 18 months of torture, unrest, dissatisfaction, trouble, and hard work. For loss of many nights of sleep, for loss of peace of mind, for loss of heart, for loss of ability to admire any other girl, for inclination to depreciate myself, for a constancy I never dreamed I possessed, for the sweet, blind, tumultuous feeling that allows no rest. In consideration of the fact that I must be paid at once, if you have not the money, I will accept your soul, no less. The dollar amount on this invoice to Dolly Grey in 1902 is $86 million. That's lack-a-waxin', but how does Zane Grey get out to the West? How does he discover the West that is his subject and his home and the place that most captures his heart? We could do 2 hours on just this slide, so this is a very, very abbreviated version. He's in New York City. He meets the great Buffalo Jones. Who is Buffalo Jones? Buffalo Jones is a well-known outdoorsman. He's an animal roper. He's the honorary game warden appointed by Theodore Roosevelt of Yosemite National Park. Buffalo Jones is also trying to breed cattle and buffalo at his ranch on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. Call them the Catalo. And he's back east in New York City trying to drum up interest for what he's trying to do out west. He and Zane Grey hook up. Zane Grey says, "Hey, Buffalo Jones, take me west, show me the Grand Canyon." And that happens. Keep in mind, this is 1907. This was before the West was open, so we take for granted today we can just zip out to Joshua Tree, zip up to the Sierra. Could not do that in 1907. You had to have a guide, you had to have an inn, you had to have someone take you. Buffalo Jones takes Zane Grey to the West. Zane Grey writes a book about it called The Last of the Plainsmen. He brings that book back to his publisher in New York City, Harper and Brothers, and they reject the ever-living shit out of this book. And he writes about this experience in that same essay. So I'd like to read to you from this same essay about how Zane Grey describes this rejection. Soon I was ushered into the presence of Mr. Hitchcock. He handed me my manuscript with a few words of regret, and he concluded, "I don't see anything in this to convince me you can write either narrative or fiction." I was stunned. I could not speak a word. Taking the manuscript, I went out. A terrible commotion labored in my breast. When I reached the wide stairway, my eyes began to grow dim. My mouth went dry and my body became cold as ice. Pay attention to this next paragraph. When I reached the corner of Pearl Street, I leaned against a tall iron post. There, my sight failed me entirely. I clutched the post with one arm and the manuscript with the other. That was the most exceedingly bitter moment of my life. I went back to Lackawaxen and told my story to my wife. Let no man ever doubt the faith and spirit and love of a woman. I sent the adventure story of Buffalo Jones on its long round, and I sat down to write my first romance of the West. That first romance of the West was Heritage of the Desert in 1910. In 1912, he writes Riders of the Purple Sage, his most famous book to this day. It is ballgame at that point. Zane Grey is in no time at all rich, world famous, and he is going places. Now, there's a very, very interesting conversation to be had about how the literary establishment saw Zane Grey, how he perceived himself as a writer. Was he a good writer? Was he a hack? It's a really interesting discussion. We won't get into that tremendously, but let me give you two anecdotes that I think are deeply meaningful. About a decade or 2 decades ago, the Library of Congress comes up with a list of 100 books that have shaped the American character. Riders of the Purple Sage is number 41 on that list. It's chronological. I want to give you a sense of what Riders of the Purple Sage is surrounded by. Number 39, The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. Number 40, I'm going to name the book. If you know the author, please raise your hand. Number 40, Pragmatism. William James, very, very good. Number 41, Riders of the Purple Sage. Number 42, raise your hand if you know the author, Tarzan of the Apes. Ed. Burroughs, very, very good. Number 43, I'm going to name the title, you tell me the author. Family Limitation. Altadena, come on. Who said Margaret Sanger? Wow. All right. People who got the correct answer, please come on up. I have a present for you. Ed, and then one more. So each of these brilliant, literate Altadenas gets a Zane Grey book. But because I want to keep this theme going, I have wrapped the books in Roma Market butcher paper. Second anecdote. In the early 1950s, 1951, 1952, the secretary, Zane Grey has passed away by this point. The Secretary of State reaches out to his wife, who's still living. They want to take Riders of the Purple Sage and drop it into Indochina as propaganda for pro-American ideals. Raise your hand if you know the answer. Who, Truman is president, who was Secretary of State under Truman in about 1951 or 1952? Yes.
John Foster Dulles?
Nope. Good guess though.
Harriman?
Nope. Dean Acheson. I have one more book, so I'll have to generate another trivia question at some point. So, Sharon and I were recently in New York. I had to see this street corner where Zane Grey had a breakdown after Last of the Plainsmen was rejected. It was about a 10-minute walk from our hotel room in Tribeca, right at the base of the Brooklyn Bridge. Friends, this is where Zane Grey broke down and committed himself to writing his great romance of the West. I think housing now. I did not see a very old, tall iron post. I saw a lot of posts for street signs. I assume that original iron post is not there anymore, unfortunately. By the way, fun fact, Zane Grey's name at birth was Pearl Zane Grey. He was bullied as a young kid, didn't like the name Pearl. Once he was on his way to becoming a writer, he got rid of it and became Zane Grey. It was also Grey, G-R-A-Y, under that switch, G-R-E-Y. All right, so that's Zane Grey. That's Zane Grey being born up until he becomes a famous writer. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So, all right. So I want to switch gears, and I want to talk a little bit about Zane Grey's ideas, his books, what it is he really believes in, what it is that really motivates him. And as Michelle said, I am not a scholar. I'm not an English professor. I'm not a literature geek. This is just my take, but I'll share it with you. I think there are three themes that really dominate Zane Grey's writing, and I would call them romances, three romances. The first is the romance of place, but specifically the romance of nature. The second is the romance of the primitive. In other words, that primitive dimension of who we are as human beings. The third, the romance of virtue. And I mean virtue in that broader sense of the Western intellectual tradition. It's truth and beauty and goodness and the moral law. I mean virtue in that way. And these themes are all over Zane Grey's writing. But for me, there's one place where they really, really come together, which is an essay he wrote in the American magazine called What the Desert Means to Me. And this essay gets republished in a book, and it takes on a different title, which is What the Open Means to Me. What is the open? Well, the open is where all of these romances converge. The romance of place, the romance of the primitive, the romance of virtue. The open is characterized by its vastness, by its immensity. This is where the human soul is stirred. This is where we can dream. This is where we can perfect our nature as human beings. That is the open. It's a really romantic idea. So what I want to do is I want to read three passages from this article. One about the romance of place, one about the romance of the primitive, one about the romance of virtue. And for each one, I'm going to put up a photo of a scene that's relevant to Zane Grey that I think adds a little bit of texture to that reading. So this is the Mogollon Rim in northern Arizona. It's about 90 minutes outside of Phoenix. Zane Grey spent a lot of time here, had a hunting and fishing cabin here, set some books here. He called it the Tonto Rim because of Tonto Creek, which came down off of it. Let's look at the Mogollon Rim and let's listen to the romance of place. Places inspire me in some sense as they did Stevenson. I love wild canyons, dry, fragrant, stone-walled, with their green-choked niches and gold-tipped ramparts. I love to get high on a promontory and gaze for hours out over a vast open desert reach, lonely and grand, with its far-flung distances and its colors. I love the great pine and the spruce forests with their spicy tang and dreamy peace and murmuring streams and wild creatures. Among the features of nature, I love color best, all of which is to say that my romances are simply the expression of my feeling for places. Wow. So someone's going to ask me tonight, what is your origin story with Zane Grey? The Mogollon Rim is my origin story with Zane Grey. It was not a book. In 2018, I went out to the Mogollon Rim to run the Zane Grey 50-mile endurance run. This is a really, really popular ultra-marathon that just hugs the Mogollon Rim. It is an absolutely beautiful place. Here's my commercial for the Rim, what they call the Rim. Don't go to the Grand Canyon. Please don't go to Sedona. Go to the Rim. It is spectacular. You can have a really, really original experience with the wild in Rim country. Romance of the primitive. So here we are in Monument Valley. In one photograph, Zane Grey is by himself. In another, he's with a woman who is not his wife. Romance of the primitive. Nature is the mother of every man. If the primitive were eliminated from man, there would be no more progress. Harness the caveman, yes, but do not kill him. Something of the wild and primitive should forever remain instinctive in the human race. All the joy of the senses lives in this law. Personal question, has anyone gone pee on a burned out lot in Altadena? Anyone find that oddly liberating, as if we're returning to a primitive way of living? I feel the same way about the loss of our material possessions, that stripped of all of our material goods, we have returned to a kind of primitive way of life. Interesting. Romance of virtue. So this is Rainbow Bridge. This was a site that Zane Grey visited. It was a subject of a couple of his books. Romance of virtue at Rainbow Bridge. When the race of man had passed, Rainbow Bridge would perhaps stand there still. It was not for many eyes to see. The tourist, the leisurely traveler, the comfort-loving motorist would never behold it. Only by toil, sweat, endurance, and pain could any man ever look at Rainbow Bridge. It seemed well to realize that the most magnificent and uplifting spectacles have to be earned. I love that line. It seemed well to realize that the most magnificent and uplifting spectacles have to be earned. So isn't Austin's mural on the Crest Trail, isn't that a kind of Rainbow Bridge? You've got to get out of your car, you've got to walk up there and look at it. It's not going to come to you. Do the work and take in that beauty through your own 2 feet. I think an even better example are the gates on Cheney Trail. There are a lot of bureaucratic and administrative reasons why there are gates on Cheney Trail. But let me give you a philosophical reason as to why those gates should almost always be closed. It is because of what Zane Grey said. It seemed well to realize that the most magnificent and uplifting spectacles have to be earned. Every time I see those gates closed, that's what I think about. I want to talk about Lonesome Dove, but I don't want to do this if most people aren't familiar with Lonesome Dove. Show of hands, how many have a passing familiarity with Lonesome Dove? Oh, wow. Okay, well, we're definitely going to do this then. So it's super interesting to read Lonesome Dove next to Zane Grey. And I reread Lonesome Dove maybe a year ago, well before this talk was planned, but also at the same time that I was reading a lot of Zane Grey books. And it really struck me when you read them next to one another, what a romantic Zane Grey is. And I want to give you an example from Lonesome Dove. So Call, who you probably know as Tommy Lee Jones from the miniseries, is having a conversation with Gus McCrae, who you probably know as Robert Duvall. And the question is, should we go to Montana? They're in Lonesome Dove, they've got a little cattle company, should they go to Montana? And this is the conversation that Call and McCrae have. Call speaks first. He says, you know, Jake does know good country when he sees it. It sounds like a cattleman's paradise, speaking of Montana. And this is what Gus McCrae says. No, it sounds like a goddamn wilderness. Why, there ain't even a house to go to. I've slept on the ground enough for one life. Now I'm in the mood for a little civilization. And that's really staggering to me to read, because Gus McCrae, Robert Duvall, probably one of the most iconic characters in Western literature. And yet he's repulsed by the idea of wilderness. It's really interesting. Zane Grey is the polar opposite. He lives for the wilderness. He dreams of the wilderness. It's the only place he wants to be. I want to give you one more example of this contrast. I want to read the last 3 lines from Heritage of the Desert. Just the last 3 lines, but just take in the romantic note on which this book ends. The sheep were bleating, a lonesome coyote barked. The white stars blinked out of the blue, and the night breeze whispered softly among the cedars. The night breeze whispered softly among the cedars. Does anybody know the last line of Lonesome Dove? The last line of Lonesome Dove is, he missed that whore. For those who don't know the story, at the end of Lonesome Dove, Gus McCrae has died. Call rides him all the way back to Lonesome Dove to bury him. When Call gets back to Lonesome Dove, he sees that the Dry Bean Saloon has burned down. Why did the Dry Bean Saloon burn down? Because the owner missed everyone who left Lonesome Dove. Who did the owner of the Dry Bean miss the most? Lorena, the house prostitute. So the very last line of Lonesome Dove, he missed that whore. You know, if Zane Grey had been alive when Lonesome Dove was published, I think he would have found it to be an absolutely appalling book. This is a guy who took virtue and ethics and romance very, very, very seriously. Lonesome Dove is none of that. So we've talked about Zane Grey's background, we've talked about his ideas. Now let's get to Southern California and Altadena. So Zane Grey moves to Southern California in about 1918. Why does he move here? He moves here to be closer to things that are important to him, and there are a lot of those. He wants to be close to Catalina, where he fishes. He wants to be close to Hollywood, where he has business interests. He wants to be close to the West, where he's still often traveling. He had visited Altadena on his honeymoon in about 1905, and he and Dolly had ridden the Mount Low Railway to the top of Echo Mountain and Mount Low. However, the first place he lands is not Altadena. The first place he lands is the Fitzgerald residence at Adams and Western, which to my mind is just central Los Angeles. Is anyone familiar with this home? I don't think it's there anymore. The architects, get ready for this, Elmer Gray and Myron Hunt, who most of you know also designed the Zane Grey estate. Is Michelle, are you here tonight? Do we have Michelle? No. Just Jim, okay. Well look, you know, one of the most interesting questions to me, and I think the reason I first got into Zane Grey, was I was really curious, you know, how much of his life, his actual life, was rooted in Altadena. How much of his life was really wrapped up in the civic and social fabric of this community. And last month we talked about Octavia Butler. The month before we talked with Michelle Hunovan. And with both Michelle Hunovan and the conversation about Octavia Butler, you really got this sense that these two writers not only lived in Altadena, but Altadena very much lived in them. This place was their home, but it was also where they wanted to be. They had a deep emotional connection to it. They felt very, very tethered to it, very, very rooted here. I have to say, I don't think that was ever the case with Zane Grey. It's disappointing to me, but I think it's the truth. You've got to realize, this guy is world famous. Altadena was a place where he could reset, take care of business, reconnect with family. This was his base of operations, but there's not much evidence that he was ever super comfortable here or ever spent a tremendous amount of time here. His son, Loren Grey, who was a psychologist, said that in his estimate, by the way, he said, I got to know my dad the last 5 years before he died. He also said that over the 20 years that they lived in Altadena, 20 years, that Zane Grey was around for about 25 to 30% of the time. Where is he? He's all over the world. He's got a fishing cabin in Oregon. He's in Tahiti. He's fishing in the Florida Keys. He's in Australia. He's in New Zealand. He's in Newfoundland. He's in Death Valley. He's in Utah. He's in Arizona. He's in Mexico. He's all of those places living his yarns when he is not in Altadena. And the newspaper coverage of him kind of reflects this. He's in the newspaper a lot. He's in the Star News. He's in the LA Times. But mostly what's being reported is where he is, what he's up to. Zane Grey's ship hits a rock wherever. Zane Grey and family leave for Utah. That's the way in which Altadenans were able to learn of and engage with Zane Grey. It's not because he was really around this community, really giving back to it in the way that Dolly Grey was. And that's why I prepared the handout that you have. Has everyone gotten a chance to take a look at it? Do me a favor, if we could just take 30 seconds, if I could ask you, read just the essay, Why I Live in Altadena. I think it's 3 or 4 paragraphs. I'll put us on the clock. Come back in 60 seconds. So I'm very curious. Those of you who find what he says about Altadena stirring and lovely and motivational and beautiful, those inspired by it, raise your hands. Okay. Those of you who find it a little bit short and transactional and utilitarian, raise your hands. That's kind of where I am. I'm a little bit on the fence. When I first saw that, I loved it. It was so special that the great Zane Grey said these great things about Altadena. The more I read it, it feels a little bit cheap and like he kind of half-assed it a little bit. I'll give you context. That essay, Why I Live in Altadena, that comes from an Altadena Chamber of Commerce brochure that was published in 1932. His contribution is one of maybe 15 contributions in that issue. He phoned it in. I will tell you the others in that issue are actually much better. The piece on the back, which to me is a really telling contrast, the appreciation of Arizona and New Mexico, that was commissioned by the U.S. Railroad Commission to drum up interest in the railroads, to drum up interest in Arizona and New Mexico. That was published in 1919. I think if you read that carefully, compare the prose from that to the prose in his little Altadena essay, it's very clear where his heart is. But here's the interesting thing. Not only did Zane Grey not really lean into Altadena, I don't think that Altadena really leaned into him. In 1925, there's an article in the Star News that according to library circulation data, nobody is reading Zane Grey's books. And there's a fascinating explanation in the news article as to why that is, and I want to read it to you. Here's the conclusion the author comes to. Even the casual observer might be safe in assuming that Western stories pall in the far West, where romance lies all about one and does not have to be searched for within book covers. In other words, if you live in a beautiful place, you don't need to read beautiful books. It seems absolute nonsense, but this was the conclusion that the author came to. Speaking of books, I forgot something. I want to go back to something. Lonesome Dove. I forgot to say this, and it's important. My copy of Lonesome Dove, the foreword is written by Taylor Sheridan of Yellowstone fame. Any Yellowstone fans in the room, have we watched it? That's really interesting to me because I have to say, I do not find Yellowstone to have anything in common with Larry McMurtry's writing. Yellowstone is a Zane Grey story. Here's my brief summary of Yellowstone. It's Kevin Costner leaning on a fence, staring out into the beautiful open as evil forces descend on land that his family has bled into and sweated on for generations. That's a Zane Grey story. That is not a Larry McMurtry story. We've got to talk about the Zane Grey estate, right? So I'm sure almost all of you know the house was not built for him. It was built in the early 1900s for another family. I want to talk about two things that he did to the house that are very interesting. So as you can see, it's 2 stories. After he buys it in 1920, he adds a 3rd story. Can anyone imagine or guess why he added that 3rd story? Just yell it out. This is right. It's less about the view and it's more about privacy. As the house originally sat, the 2nd story was level with the street. And so if he was on the 2nd floor writing, someone on the street could look right in and see him. He wanted the privacy of being elevated far above the level of the street. This is the more interesting addition to the house. In 1928, he builds an entire wing. It's called the East Wing. And here it is. This is a 7,000 square foot addition to the house. Here's what's interesting about it. There is no staircase between the 1st and 2nd floor. The only way to get to the 1st floor is from the outside. The only way to get to the 2nd story is across this bridge, this breezeway from the main house. Now, he is not even in Altadena when any of this work is being done. He's in Tahiti, and he's writing letters to Dolly Gray telling her how to handle this work, how to build his office and library on the 2nd story. And the question comes up in their correspondence is, hey, don't we have to have a staircase that connects the 2nd floor to the 1st floor? And I want to read to you what Zane Grey says to Dolly from the same book of their letters about this issue. Tell Ed I don't need a stairway. Now brace yourself for this next line. Tell Ed I don't need a stairway. My goodness, in case of a fire, couldn't I just get out of a window? Wow. But build a blooming place of brick and cement if that's not too expensive. Keep to my specifications in regard to dimensions. The study should be a peach and have everything. But as far as taste goes, you can use your judgment if it comes to a pinch. Ed knows what I think I would like about size, windows, safe, fireplace, window seats, bookcases, cabinets, lights, etc. I'm delighted with the prospect. It'll keep me home more. He says this many times in their correspondences that once the house is fully built out, that he will spend more time in Altadena. The truth is, and I can't remember where I read this, he was never very comfortable in the house and never loved it that much. So here's a view of the East Wing from the back. It made the news. Author is surprised with new study when he arrives from trip. So this is the East Wing. So when he says to Dolly, hey, if there's a fire, I'll just get out the window, he's talking about these 2nd story windows here. They'll just repel down. Sidewalks. Sidewalks. What kind of community gathering would this be if we did not talk about sidewalks in Altadena? So this correspondence actually comes well after Zane Grey has passed away. This is a letter that his son Romer Grey gets from the county. And what is the county bothering Romer Grey about? Here's what they're bothering him about. This is the rule, and this might still be the rule, I don't know. But here was the rule back then. If 50% of a block had sidewalks, it was the responsibility of the owner where there was no sidewalk to either pay to have one installed or to pay the county to do it. as you can see. And keep in mind, originally the Zane Grey estate runs from Mariposa all the way down to Mendocino. Guess who the holdout is in that block with no sidewalk? It's the original Zane Grey estate. No sidewalk. Had to throw that in with all the conversations we're having about sidewalks as we recover as a community. Who knows of Zane Grey Terrace right next to Rubio Canyon? So why is Zane Grey Terrace called Zane Grey Terrace? It's because he used to own all that land. He owned about 30 or 40 acres there. In the late 40s, early 50s, it was initially going to be subdivided for veteran housing. That never happened. In the late 50s, early 60s, there's a whole other flurry of newspaper advertisements dividing up the Zane Grey Rancho to build the Zane Grey Estates. So that was his land, a 40-acre ranch that he had in Altadena in addition to the Zane Grey Estate. Also, who knows of Wildwood Park down at the bottom of East Palm? So Dolly Grey, who was doing things with her own money, at one point owned land in Wildwood Park. I've got a title to property with her name on it. All right, we've got to talk about this house. So this is 2167 Crescent. How many people know this house? How many people have been inside of it? Okay. So this house, also built by Elmer Gray and Myron Hunt. Zane Grey, as many of you probably know, built this house for his secretary, who was also rumored to be one of his mistresses, Mildred K. Smith. This house did not survive the Eaton fire. At the time of the fire, and I think still, it was owned by Charles Olachi, who is a past director of JPL. In the correspondences between Dolly and Zane Grey, she writes to him about this house. And I want to read to you what she says. I've been harboring a horrid suspicion recently that so many letters and telegrams from you meant you were trying to cover the Mildred K. Smith trail. That you were sending her a lot. I keep thinking of what the telegraph and post office think, for they all know you. Get ready for this next line. That building for her in Altadena was the most bonehead, and for me, the most humiliating thing you ever did. Moreover, I've been bombarded with bills for books and things that you were sending her. Wow. In 1928, the Altadena Auditorium Association is formed. The Altadena Auditorium Association is formed with one purpose: to build a civic and commercial block between Lake and El Molino along Mariposa. Does that location sound familiar to anyone? It's Mariposa Junction. Well, guess what was going to anchor that civic and commercial block? It was going to be anchored by the Zane Grey Theater. This was going to be a 600 to 800 seat auditorium. He was going to decorate it with all of his personal treasures from his travels. It was going to host his movies. It was going to host performing arts. As Michelle said, I'm not a scholar or an economic historian. 1928, I am assuming, Depression, money goes away, this never happened. But keep that in mind as we dream about Mariposa Junction. There was a day when it was going to be anchored by the Zane Grey Theater. Let's talk about crime. So, how many people are appreciative of the sheriff's updates at the town council hearings, but find them a little bit boring? Well, imagine that it's 1920, and imagine that Captain Marquez appears before the Altadena Town Council, and he gives this update. 1920. Zane Grey, author and novelist, famed for his writings of border, desert, and western ranger stories, experienced a real thrill early this morning at his home in Altadena when he spied a typical burglar jimmying his window. Always on the alert for material for his novels, Mr. Grey quickly located his .38 caliber pistol, and banged away at the thug until the revolver chamber was empty. For some reason or other, the shots went wide of the mark. For the last scene of the burglar, he was hot-footing it down North Marengo into the darkness. As the chair of Altadena Heritage, I would like to bring back historic architecture. I would also like to bring back more daring criminality. These catalytic converter thefts are not on the level of someone trying to break into the Zane Grey estate while Zane Grey is living there. When I read that, I thought, my understanding is that Cormac McCarthy lived for most of his years in Santa Fe. And he worked out of a think tank in Santa Fe called the Santa Fe Institute. I mean, imagine breaking into Cormac McCarthy's place in Santa Fe. He's over a typewriter writing Blood Meridian. I mean, this is not the kind of person that sensible people should be trying to commit crimes against. But speaking of gunfire, let's go out to Catalina. So as many of you know, Zane Grey had a house on Catalina. That house is now a hotel. Does anyone know what shape the swimming pool of that hotel is in? An arrowhead. Wow, isn't that cool? Well, Zane Grey had a chef. The chef's name was George Takahashi. George Takahashi went everywhere with Zane Grey. Abroad, the desert, also went out to Catalina with him. Well, one day, the whole gang is out in Catalina, and George Takahashi hears his wife screaming, Takahashi's wife. He runs over to where she is, and he sees his best friend trying to make a move on his wife. He shoots his best friend, shoots him in the groin. When law enforcement shows up, the friend is so ashamed and embarrassed that the friend says, no, it was a suicide attempt, I was trying to kill myself. The truth comes out that in fact Takahashi shot him. And Takahashi is charged with attempted murder in Catalina. It's the 1920s. There is a common law legal doctrine called the unwritten law. What does the unwritten law mean? It means that a man can use deadly force to stand up for and protect the honor of his wife. So George Takahashi is freed. The charges are dismissed. This gets reported in the newspaper. Jack husband freed on unwritten law. And there's a picture of George Takahashi. A couple more pictures. On the left, George is giving Zane Grey a haircut. On the right, they are in Arizona. So this just gives you a scope of the enormousness of this guy's life. In 1935, Zane Grey goes to southern Australia to go deep sea fishing for great white sharks. He was actually a much better fisherman than he ever was a hunter. We most think of his Western romances. Most of his nonfiction writing is about his fishing. He was one of the great anglers of his time. Freshwater fishing, deep sea fishing. So in 1935, he set sail for Australia to go deep sea fishing for great white sharks. To this day, there are fishing implements named after Zane Grey. In his lifetime, he owned 2 yachts. His yachts were unfit to make the journey to Australia, so he charters a steamship, the SS Mariposa, to take him down to Australia. Famously, he packs the steamship with 166 pieces of luggage. When he gets to Australia, the entire town comes out to greet the great Zane Grey, the great world-famous Zane Grey. One of his things when he traveled, it was an inviolable principle of his travels, he did not stay in hotels. He always wanted to stay outside in the elements. This local town restarts a lumber mill that had closed down just to mill flooring so that Zane Grey can build an outdoor campsite.
Wow.
To this day, if you're in that part of the world, you can eat at the Zane Grey restaurant and bar. There is a mural, which you can see. There's a quote, it might be too small for you. That quote is, "I need this wild life, this freedom." The full quote, "I need this wild life, this freedom, so I can stare into nature and so into my soul." That comes from a letter that Zane Grey wrote to Dolly Grey before he left with Buffalo Jones for Arizona. And it lives on a mural in New Zealand today. That gives you a sense of just how enormous this guy's impact was. The home in Lackawaxen, like the Zane Grey estate here, that home is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's not only that, it's also a museum to this day. The local boat launch into the Delaware River is called the Zane Grey Boat Launch. The bridge over the Lackawaxen River is the Zane Grey Bridge. There are 3 roads around the home in the community named after Zane Grey. There's a Purple Sage Drive, a Zane Grey Lane, and a Wildfire Court. I mean, he really, really leaned into Lackawaxen, and Lackawaxen really, really leaned into him. You really get this sense of the impact he left on places. Oregon, the Rogue River in western Oregon. Zane Grey had a fishing cabin at Winklebar. This fishing cabin is on the National Register of Historic Places. He had a hunting and riding cabin right underneath the Mogollon Rim. That race I did essentially goes through the backyard. That home burned in a fire in the early 1990s. That cabin has been completely rebuilt. It is now a museum in the heart of downtown Payson, Arizona, 90 minutes from Phoenix. So this picture on the right is from the top of the Sam Merrill Trail. One of my favorite things to do in Altadena, one of my long runs, long adventures, was I would go in the Pinecrest Gate, I would hop on the Mount Wilson Toll Road, take the toll road up to Henniger Flats, go another couple miles to the Idle Hour Trail, take the Idle Hour Trail all the way down to the Idle Hour Campground, take it all the way up to Inspiration Point. When you get to Inspiration Point, you're still in the woods a little bit, but you're at the very top of the Upper Sam Merrill Trail. About a quarter of a mile, you come around the bend, and there is Altadena beneath you. That is a place in Altadena where I have always felt the romance of place, of nature, the romance of the primitive, the romance of virtue. And I miss this place so much. I miss it so much. I just want to be like out in the open again. Up there. And, you know, I think something has happened in this community after the fire. I think we've become even more open. We're more open with one another, as neighbors, as friends. I think that this fire opened the community geographically, topographically. We can see more of it. We can see aspects of our geography that we could never see before because trees were in the way, because brush was in the way. We can see homes as they're being framed. We've got all this visibility now that we didn't have before. And I just feel like this place has always been the open. And right now, man, I gotta tell you, it just feels like infinitely the open. And I think my greatest wish, as we all come back, is that it really stays that way. So here's to the open in Altadena. I've got one more reading. Was Zane Grey God? He was not God. He was a very complicated guy. I think an absolutely brilliant, brilliant guy, not God. I do hope that tonight, you feel like he has risen, that he's with us in this room. But I want to read his closing to the same essay that I've read from a couple times tonight. Last reading, I'll stop when I finish reading it. Thank you again for being here. One more reading. Was Zane Grey God? We all have in our hearts the kingdom of adventure. Somewhere in the depths of every soul is the inheritance of the primitive day. I speak to that. But my own investigation, my reading of frontier history, my long strife to explore the lonely and hidden wilderness of the West have proved to me that hard men of the open also climb to the heights of nobility and sacrifice, to a supreme proof of the evolution of man, to a realization of God. Wow. Thank you all so much for being here with me. I don't know a ton about Zane Grey, but I'm happy to try to answer any additional questions you might have. Just yell them out. I will repeat them in the microphone because it might be hard for people to hear. Ed.
Did Zane Grey know people like Louis L'Amour or Will James or Owen Winster?
So the question was, did he know Louis L'Amour? Did he know these other writers? Here's my answer to that. I think probably not. I think that Zane Grey he read everyone, and he knew of everyone's writing, but he was very much wrapped up in his own business, in being Zane Grey, in the livelihood of Zane Grey. So he didn't see himself as a connoisseur of literature. I think he was aware of all of their work, but you never really get the sense that he saw himself as part of this broader literary community where he's in constant fellowship or discussion with other writers. Anyone else? Please.
Did Dolly ever travel with him, or did she always stay over there?
So the question was, did Dolly ever travel with Zane Grey? And the answer is yes and no. You know, they would go back to Lackawaxen together. There were some family trips. But by and large, as a general rule, he was always abroad on his own with his adventures. I think part of that is probably because of the mistresses. He was with other women a lot whenever he was traveling. That was a huge part of his life. I didn't go into that aspect of his life. It's interesting, but it's not interesting. But Dolly was, this is why Dolly Grey deserves an Altadena Revealed of her own. She was part of the fabric of this community, head and shoulders above him. So I hope that when the Altadena Library reopens, that there can be some kind of permanent remembrance of Dolly Grey in the Altadena Library. She was also on the board of an Altadena bank. She was very, very rooted here. But unfortunately, he was most often elsewhere without her. That's my sense. Michelle.
Zane Grey is often called the interpreter of the West, or the rest of the country that's not in the West. And I know I've only read Purple Sage, but he's got a lot to say about Mormons. Did you come across this in other books? Is there anything you can fill in on the Mormons?
So a couple of things there. First, let's talk about the Mormons. So it is true that there was a lot about the Mormons that Zane Grey disapproved of. He didn't like the religious fanaticism. He did not like polygamy. However, it is also true that he had tremendous respect for the Mormons. These are people who settled the desert. These were some of the original pioneers. He has written an essay called "The Man I Admire the Most" about a Mormon named Jim Emmett. The largest collection of Zane Grey materials are at BYU, of all places. If Zane Grey really has a hostile relationship with Mormons, what on earth are his archives doing at BYU? To the question about Zane Grey being an interpreter of the West, very important to understand the moment at which he went to the West and wrote about the West. It's between two periods. He doesn't have to deal with any of the hardships of the pioneers and settlers, but he also gets to the West before the tourist crowds and before it really became a known thing. So he's operating in the West, he's writing in the West at a real historical sweet spot. And I think fairly can be said to be, to this day, one of the great interpreters of the West in America. I'm sure that's why Riders of the Purple Sage is number 41 on the Library of Congress list of books that have shaped the American character. To this day, his writing and his thinking are foundational to the way that we think about and dream about the West. I forgot to pull up one slide. I'm not going to say much about it. On the Altadena Heritage website, I created a page. The page is called Readers of the Rubio Sage. I uploaded about 10 to 12 articles, just great Zane Grey essays, onto this webpage. If you want to whip out your phone at any moment, take this QR code and you can read all of the Zane Grey essays I've uploaded, many of them in the spirit of what I read tonight. Any other questions? Sure.
Who published him after he was rejected by Harper?
Well, Harper and Brothers did. So the very same agent who rejected Last of the Plainsmen got Heritage of the Desert, and Harper, my understanding is Harper and Brothers was his publisher for the bulk of his literary career. Here's the thing though, his publishing, it's very, very hard to track because he's in the Zane Grey business. So these books are printed, they're reprinted, they get serialized in magazines, they get serialized in other magazines. It's a different publishing industry than what we know today, and they're just kind of all over the place. And again, he's in the Zane Grey business, so he's got different printers, different publishers constantly bringing his work to his readers. Dawn.
How much influence do you think Theodore Roosevelt?
So Dawn asked, how much influence did Theodore Roosevelt have on Zane Grey? I don't know. A huge historical blind spot for me. In everything I've read, I've never seen any references to Roosevelt in his own autobiographical writings. You know, he references Robert Louis Stevenson. He references James Fenimore Cooper. I've never seen him reference the life or the writings or the work of Theodore Roosevelt. But again, there are multiple biographies of Zane Grey I have not read, so it's a good question. Sure.
Do you know the particular book he wrote in Altadena?
I don't, but he lived here, you know, officially from 1920 to 1939. He did most of his writing, well, I think it's mixed. He did a lot of his writing at the source. That was important to him. And it was important, by the way, for his movies too. He wanted to film those at the source. So if he was writing about the Mogollon Rim, he wanted to be underneath the Mogollon Rim. If he was writing about the Painted Desert, he wanted to be in the Painted Desert. But he would, you know, as I said, he would come back to Altadena in between his adventures. He would reset. He'd hand off all of his work to Dolly. So that's a long period of time, 20 years, that he was doing work in Altadena. So I think we can assume that a good number of his books, maybe they weren't written in full here, but I'm sure that his pen touched his books, you know, repeatedly in Altadena. Yeah?
The upper left is from Catalina Island. That's his high school. Did he spend much time there writing, spending vacations?
So his connection to Catalina was largely the famous Catalina Tuna Club, which I don't know a lot about, but the Catalina Tuna Club was one of the original, I'm blanking on the name, but he fished swordfish, marlin, tuna, sailfish, right? Sailfish? Did someone say? Yeah. And that was his main reason for wanting to be in Catalina. So I do think he did a lot of his writing there. I think it's also probably true that he liked Catalina more than Altadena, because fishing, you know, I haven't gotten deep into his fishing writing. I don't fish myself, so fishing, I don't have as much mental traction with it as I do with, I don't hunt either, but I can, you know, I spend a lot of time in rim country. So when he talks about the rim, I know the trailheads, I know the views, I've been there, I've raced on it. I don't know a lot about fishing, so I have a harder time with his fishing writing, but I think it's fair to say that he liked Catalina more than Altadena, if not equal to. Jim?
What will the legacy of the Zane Grey property be?
I don't know. I've never met the owner, so I have to say, huge hit on my soul. I was never in the Zane Grey estate. I never made my way into the mistress's home at 2167 Crescent. I never got to see the inside of those properties. I've never been inside the Zane Grey Hotel. I was recently in Catalina. Some friends and I do a bike camping trip around Catalina once a year. And on the way home, I like to just ride by the Zane Grey Hotel and take a picture. I've never been inside of it. What will the legacy of those properties be? I don't know. I've also never met the owners. So, look, it's, you know, in fairness to them, a lot of people live in historic homes with really, really rich texture. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily important to them. And we've got to honor and respect that. For selfish reasons, I would hope that they were Zane Grey lovers and fanatics, but if they weren't, that's 100% their prerogative, and they will do with that property what obviously they want to do with it. So I just don't know what the legacy of those properties will be. I can't, oh, sure.
What one biography of Zane Grey do you recommend?
Well, there's one that's just a friendly kind of breeze, but I am working my way now through Zane Grey, his life, his adventures, his women. This is probably the definitive biography of Zane Grey. It's written by an English professor from the University of Delaware. There are a lot of little trade biographies that in their way they read like Zane Grey novels. It's amazing how much I think they get, not that I'm some kind of scholar, but you'll see obvious things they get wrong. I think if you're a serious person and you really, really want the official treatment, I think it's Zane Grey, his life, his adventures, his women, by Thomas Pauly. Yes?
Yeah, so looking forward, I mean, you had a slide of Zane Grey and Romans, I suppose, to show pictures of Foster and Zane Grey books in a used bookstore, and they look quite old. You go to Romans now, the whole Western section is an half. So what do you see the future of Zane Grey? Popularity?
Yeah. The question was, what's the future of Zane Grey's popularity? What's the future of his books? You know, I don't know the answer to that. The Western genre is a huge genre now. I think he's obviously still very, very important to it. I think we probably don't read his books today to the extent people used to. You know, I love Nikki High, and I love what she's done with Octavia's bookshelf. But for me, this is just me, I like the experience of going to a used bookstore in Montana, digging through a box. Every Zane Grey book I have is used. They're all worn in various ways. That's just the way I like to engage with his books. I don't think I've ever owned a new Zane Grey book, and I think that to the extent, you know, you can't separate his life from his writing, and it's such a intertwined thing, and he's such a big character. I think people who love Zane Grey will just continue to collect Zane Grey things, and that will be how he lives on in us and in literature. There is, I should have mentioned this, there is a Zane Grey West Society. It's about 50 years old. They meet every year in Western places. It's a bunch of Zane Grey dorks who get together to, And they go down these rabbit holes that are really impressive. I mean, they're super interested in, you know, they're collecting, oh, I want this first edition of this run of this book. They take really, really deep dives on really niche historical aspects of Zane Grey's life. So if you're super curious and want to follow a group that's doing a lot of work on Zane Grey to this day, the Zane Grey West Society is a great group to connect with. Lori.
Also, I think my father had a bunch of first editions, which of course burned in fire. But pay attention to the illustrators, because quite a few of his early books have some noted artists. I can't name them, but they were really amazing sketches. Some of them have full plates in them that, you know, did a beautiful image of, you know, horses, for example, on Vitamin City. And it's just, I think the illustrations really add to what you might want to consider when you grab one of the used Zane Grey books.
Thank you for saying that. So what Lori said, she reminded me, a lot of the early editions of Zane Grey's books are illustrated. The illustrations are beautiful. They are a reason to seek out and try to collect first or early edition Zane Grey books. They're expensive. They're not insanely expensive. I mean, a first run Riders of the Purple Sage, that's going to be $1,000 or more. But you can get a good first edition for a couple hundred. You can get a good early edition for 10 or 20 bucks. I buy a lot of my Zane Grey books on eBay. Again, there are so many of them out there, it's not hard to find them. And I do think that they are a great, just because of his story in the West, they really are a great case for the used bookstore for tracking down the early edition, feeling it, running your hands through it. Maybe I'm a bit of a romantic with that, but that's just the way I see it. I would never want there to be a Zane Grey bookstore in Altadena. I want to thank Bungalow Heaven Neighborhood Association one more time for feeding us. And thank you all so much for listening to me talk about someone I just really, really love. You're all dear, dear friends. Thank you.